At my previous parish, there was a family with 3 adopted children, and their middle child was struck by a car and killed just a few days before his 17th birthday. And the parents were understandably devastated by this. A few days after the accident, another parishioner told me that the mother had been in our parish adoration chapel the night before. "Father," the parishioner said, "she was in the chapel and she was just screaming, just yelling." The parishioner clearly thought that the mother's behavior was somehow inappropriate or uncalled for, or shouldn't have been taking place, and they wanted me to correct her for disturbing the adoration chapel and those who were praying. I explained to the parishioner that if yelling was what the mother needed to do, then it was perfectly okay for her to yell. See, many people think that prayer has to be formal and dignified. We think that our private prayers should sound like the prayers in the liturgy. We think that there are things we aren't allowed to say in prayer, that we aren't allowed to be mad at God, or to blame God, or to disagree with Him. It seems to be what a lot of people think. We're not supposed to feel those ways, and so we certainly shouldn't say them in prayer. But that isn't the example that the Scriptures give us. In our first reading today for Mass, the prophet Jeremiah is praying to God. Now, Jeremiah has done everything that the Lord asked him to do, but in return, he has faced persecution, and the people haven't listened to him or repented. And so he is frustrated. And so he cries out in our first reading to God, "You duped me, O Lord, and I let myself be duped. You were too strong for me, and you triumphed. All the day I am an object of laughter. Everyone mocks me." He is accusing God of deceiving him, of being dishonest with him. He has followed the Lord's command, and it's only brought him hardship, and he is angry at God for this. And he tells God that directly. He goes on to say that he is considered even giving up, of no longer proclaiming the message that God gives him. Notice that Jeremiah does not worry about being nice. He speaks to God honestly, even accusing God. We see something similar in the gospel today. Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to suffer and be killed, and Peter doesn't like this, so he tells Jesus that. "No, Lord, that will never happen to you." Now, it's tempting to look down on Peter for this, but we have to give Peter some credit. He is speaking honestly. I'm sure that many of the other disciples also did not like the idea of Jesus having to suffer and die. But unlike Peter, they don't say anything. But Peter does. And although Jesus' words to Peter in response might seem harsh, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do," they also help Peter to grow. See, Peter had a false understanding about Jesus that needed to be corrected. But the only way it could be corrected is if it was brought to Jesus. Because Peter speaks honestly, Jesus is able to correct him, and he's able to grow in his understanding of what Jesus' mission truly is. If Peter hadn't been honest with Jesus, if he'd kept quiet, his misconception would not have been corrected. This is why it's also important for us to make sure that we speak honestly with God in prayer. When we go to the doctor, for example, we have to tell the doctor honestly what's wrong. And sometimes that can be embarrassing. But if we don't speak honestly with the doctor, if we succumb to the embarrassment and hide things from the doctor, then they won't be able to treat us. Likewise, we need God to heal our souls. We need Him to heal our anger, our jealousy, our sinfulness. But in order for God to heal those things, we first need to bring them to Him. If I hide those things from God because I'm embarrassed or because I think I'm not supposed to talk about those things in prayer, then they will never be healed. They will become a wound in my soul that festers in the dark. rather than being healed in the light of God's grace. In our second reading today, St. Paul tells the Romans, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. But in order to be transformed, they first need to acknowledge what in them needs change and to bring that to God so that he can transform it. Back to St. Peter again. Remember, if he hadn't spoken honestly with Jesus, his false ideas would not have been healed. Likewise, if we don't speak honestly to God in prayer, bringing him the parts of ourselves that need to be healed and transformed, he won't be able to work in us. So tell me, do you ever feel angry with God? Well, tell him that. Do you ever blame God for something or want to blame him for something? Then tell him that. We need to speak to God honestly in prayer, to tell him what our temptations and our struggles, what our sins are. What are those things that you want to do and you know that you shouldn't, but you still do? Tell God about that. Don't be embarrassed. Don't hide it. Don't use euphemisms. Speak to God honestly. And if that means you have to yell at God, then yell. If it means you have to use language that you don't think you're supposed to use for God, well, then use it. If it means saying things that you think you shouldn't say them anyways. Because it's only when those things are brought to the Lord that he can transform them. Right now in your heart, what is the one thing that you are most embarrassed or uncomfortable telling God about? What is that thing that you think, I could never say this to God? And I invite you to place it here on the altar. That just as the bread and the wine are placed on the altar and then transformed by God's grace, so too, bring honestly to the Lord whatever in you needs to be transformed. Don't hide it. Don't dress it up. Don't cover it over with euphemisms. Bring it to the Lord honestly. Place it on his altar so that his grace can transform us.